This is a tutorial on multiplication and division of real numbers. There are three basic rules to multiplying and dividing numbers. The first one is, if you have two positive numbers and you multiply and divide them, you will get a positive number. So if we had 3 times 3, these are both positive, so we would end up with a positive 9. If we had a positive 12 and we divided it by a positive 6, we would get a positive 2. The second rule is that if you have one negative and one positive, you end up with a negative number. So if we had a positive 3 and we multiplied it by negative 3, we would end up with a negative 9. Again, one negative and one positive equals a negative. Same thing with division. If we had a positive 12 and we divided it by a negative 6, we would end up with a negative 2. And then our last rule, two negative numbers always make a positive number. So to stay with the pattern, if we had a negative 3 times a negative 3, we would end up with a positive 9. And then if we had a negative 12 and we divided it by a negative 6, we would get a positive 2. So to remember this, if you ever have two of the same type of number, two positive numbers make a positive number. Two negative numbers make a positive number. You only get a negative number when you have one positive and one negative number. So let's practice this with some multiplication first. Here we have 56 times 2. So multiply them together, we'll get 112. Now 112 is a positive 112 because both 56 and 2 are positive numbers. Let's look at our next example. 3 halves times a negative 4/5. We would multiply this, pretend like the sign's not even there. So 3 times 4 is 12. 2 times 5 is 10. This reduces to 6/5. And now go back and check your signs. Here we have a positive 3 halves and a negative 4/5. So since we have one positive and one negative, this is actually a negative 6/5. Then our last example is negative 6 times negative 6. Well, 6 times 6 is just 36. And then since we have two negatives, this turns into a positive 36. Now let's talk about division. Here we have 14 divided by 2. So 14 divided by 2 is equal to 7. So 14 divided by 2 is equal to 7, and these are both positive numbers, so our 7 is positive. Now let's look at the second example. Here we have 1/3 divided by a negative 2 3/8. Well, if we really want to do this, let's convert this negative 2 3/8 into a fraction. So this would be 8 times 2 is 16, and then add 3 more. So we would have 19/8 negative. 19/8 is equal to 2 3/8. And now if we have 1/3 divided by 19/8, the simplest way to do that is to forget about this division and multiply by the reciprocal of 19/8. So what we would get is 1/3 times a negative 8 over 19. Remember, if you're dividing by fractions, it's easier to multiply by the reciprocal. So we multiply across, we get 1 times negative 8. That's an 8. And then 3 times 19 is 57. And then we have one negative and one positive number. So this is a negative 8/57. Now let's look at our last example. Here we have a negative 3/4 divided by a negative 5 halves. So 3/4 divided by 5 halves, they're both negative. Now remember, the easiest way to divide by a fraction is to multiply by its reciprocal. So what we're going to get is negative 3/4 times a negative 2/5. Multiply across and forget about the signs for right now. 3 times 2 is 6. 4 times 5 is 20. So this is going to reduce down to 3/10. And what we have one negative and we have a second negative. So since they're both negative terms, this is going to turn into a positive. So our answer is a positive 3/10. The last thing we're going to discuss in this tutorial is 0. 0 is a special number when it comes to multiplying and dividing. If we multiply anything by 0, it always equals 0. So 17 times 0 would be 0. If we had 3 times 0, that would equal to 0. 2/3 times 0 also equal to 0. Even negative numbers, negative 6 times 0 is equal to 0. If you multiply anything by 0, it will always equal 0. Now let's talk about dividing 0. If we take 0 and divide it 7 times, you're going to end up with 0. You can divide 0 by any number and you will always get 0. 0 divided by negative 4 is 0. The easiest way to remember this is imagine you had $0 and you and your 6 friends, or the 7 of you, were trying to split up your $0. How many dollars would each of you have? Well, if you didn't have any money to begin with and you split up no money, then all of you don't have any money. You all have $0. So always remember that if you take 0 and divide it by any number, you will always get 0. Now lastly, what happens when you divide by 0? If we take 7 and divide it by 0, that doesn't really make any sense. You can't divide 7 by 0. You can divide 7 one time, you can divide 7 2 times, but you can't divide 7 0 times. So anytime you divide by 0, you have an undefined answer. So anytime you see anything divided by 0, it's considered undefined.